Jerry and I are planning to take Murray on her first road trip adventure so she can spend some time in nature and experience the connection to nature that we really value and enjoy in our lives here. And it could be a disaster, but hopefully it will be a beautiful experience. Go.
Lauren and I had been together for about 10 years already, just the two of us. And starting family was not on our agenda at all. But time passes and the situation changes, and we were getting old, I suppose.
When I see Murray, it's always fun to kind of figure out, this part from me and other part from Jerry and all her personality quirks and everything. And I suppose it reinforces that it's important that I know where I come from so she can know where she comes from as well. Cheers.
Lauren put in years of serious detective work to uncover the mysteries and secrets of her life. What makes me angry, what makes me livid, is just as we're sort of bedding into this new pace of life, kind of out of the blue comes a haunting reminder from the past, really. It's an episode that we thought was behind us has emerged again.
I didn't find out I was donor conceived until I was in my early 20s, and when I started my search for my biological father, I didn't know where that would lead me. I thought I must be the host. Who the hell's the host?
Lauren's been a beacon for the donor conceived community, and it's been wonderful seeing her story play out, and many of the positive aspects of that have given hope to the donor conceived community.
It's very kind of cathartic to talk about it with other people like yourselves who get it. And that personal experience that I have of being separated from family of origin, it's really, I suppose that's what drives me.
Lauren has been so instrumental in bringing forward the changes in Victoria to ensure that we understand our family history and to have access to that. And it was such a progressive, world-first change.
And then suddenly it seemed that there was a different agenda at play. So the wishes of the parents were at the forefront. They were taking centre stage rather than the children that were going to be born as a result of this process.
It just makes me so mad to see that legacy getting dismantled that I think that's enough motivation for me to come back and get involved again and start, meeting with MPs, ministers, whatever it takes.
Having Lauren back involved is just such a comfort that we can make things happen.
Sorry, I think we're going to have to wrap up here. I'd love to speak for longer, but we have to get Murray her bath. For 5 years of my life, I didn't know who I was, and I know what that feels like. It's really difficult to move forward with your life when you're in that situation.
Oh, that's pretty nice.
I was able to solve the pieces of the puzzle for myself, but it's not fair that just I get to do this and others don't. We should all have that right. Everyone in my family had blue eyes, a little bit of a wonky nose or something. So I never really questioned that there was something amiss. My parents separated when I was about 2 years old. So I grew up living with my mum, but I still, Dad was quite involved in my day-to-day life.
So lucky to have you.
Aww.
In 2005, when Lauren was 21, I told her that she was donor conceived. I really did worry that she would find out accidentally through her father's medical treatment. She would see that his blood type or DNA didn't match her own.
Bruce is actually infertile.
And I was very nervous.
And she said, "Oh, Dad's not your biological father." So it was a pretty awkward conversation. I think it was hard for her to find the words. My initial reaction was one of shock, and that actually stayed with me for a long time.
In my 20s, I really wasn't that keen on having children, but then I changed my mind. One morning in my way to work, my husband told me that he'd had himself tested and that he was infertile. And he also said that the doctor that he'd seen had suggested donor conception as a way to have a family.
In the early 80s, the creation of technology to freeze and store sperm kicked off a donor insemination boom across Australia.
This tank is known as Father of the Year. In the last 24 months, it's produced 176 babies.
Sperm that was donated before 1988 was donated on the understanding that the donor would remain anonymous and their identity would not be released unless they consented.
The semen is kept in these small plastic straws, which are carefully coded in order to protect the identity of the donor.
I knew that adoption wasn't for me, and it did seem like a really good idea. And when I finally did become pregnant, I was absolutely over the moon. I was just so happy and relieved.
When Lauren was conceived in 1983, there were no laws defining the relationship in donors and offspring.
The culture was, if you become pregnant, take the child home and forget about the way it was conceived. Just pretend it's your child. And nobody knew. I didn't discuss it with my family or friends. It was a complete secret. The only one that knew were my husband and myself.
As more and more donor babies reach adulthood, they're expressing anxieties about their identity.
I think it really denies us the dignity of the truth.
Society changed. Adoptive children could identify their parents. So too the pressures came for, if you like, making available information concerning the identity of a donor. It was a difficult balance about you promised people anonymity and you were going back on that promise.
Victoria enacted legislation in 1988, which was a world first. It was groundbreaking. It meant that donor-conceived people could apply for information about their donors, recipient parents could apply for information about their donors, and donors could apply for information about their offspring.
But the legislation only applied to children conceived after 1988, which didn't include Lauren, myself and countless others.
The donor code was C11.
All that I knew about my biological father was he had blonde hair and blue eyes, he was 5'11", and he was known by this pseudonym of C11.
Blood group A positive.
What are you? I made an application to the voluntary register in which you state your donor code and some information which they use to match with donor or half-siblings. But for me, there were no matches, so that was a dead end.
It was a long and just frustratingly slow process to go through, and 2 years later she didn't have the information that she was looking for and never really felt like she was any closer to getting there either.
This one's for our group called Tangled Webs. We're like a lobby group. We're kind of challenging donor conception and trying to highlight the other side of it, not just the glamorous side. And
in 2008, a counsellor put me in touch with Narelle Gretsch, and she thought that it would be beneficial for me to meet another adult donor conceived person.
I found out I was donor conceived when I was 15 years old, which is a pretty bizarre age to find out.
Like Lauren, Narelle was conceived at Prince Henry's Hospital with donor sperm, and she was actually delivered in 1982, the year before Lauren was born, by Dr. Gab Kovacs.
I'd love to just know my donor's nationality.
Try as she might, Narelle was unable to find the identity of her biological father, but she found a code and the fact that she had 8 half-siblings.
This is a letter from Professor Kovacs telling me that whilst I understand you might be a bit frustrated, the situation was made quite clear to your mum and dad before they commenced the treatment. So I'm just going to have to deal with that, obviously.
It was a real turning point to be able to meet someone that had a similar history and understood what I was feeling. She was a real mentor for me in how I might start to go about my own search. By the time I met Narelle, the donor records were moved to the Public Records Office of Victoria, and the Infertility Treatment Authority gained guardianship over those records, and they were able to access them.
I knew who C11 was. The difficulty is there was nothing I could do. If Lauren had been conceived after 88, she would have had the rights and we would have been providing this service without a second thought. Because she was conceived at a time when legislation didn't apply, it was a whole different ballgame. And that feels okay to you?
One day she told me that the donor code letter actually referred to the first letter of the man's surname. So my donor code was C11, so I knew that I was looking for someone whose surname started with the letter C. The only other information I had was that his date of birth was January 1957.
Lauren knew that the main group of donors were medical students from Monash University. So she managed to get a list of the medical graduates over 3 or 4 years that the donor probably came from.
My name is Lauren Burns and I'm the author of my own story.
By 2009, Lauren was underway with a PhD that was sponsored by Boeing. She was the poster child of the university.
I never thought I'd be designing the technology of the future, but at RMIT, I am.
At the same time, she was putting together this enormous dossier of information on C11, everything that she had, reading the laws, reading international law, human rights law, trying to find the weak points to go and push on.
The well-intentioned advice was that I should just put all these questions in a box and try to forget about it and move on, and that would be the best thing for everyone's happiness. But I was worried that I was going to never answer this mystery.
I, David Moritz de Kretser, swear by Almighty God that I
When David de Kretser became Governor of Victoria, my mother saw him in the publicity and it actually triggered her memory that he was her treating doctor. So that was when I thought that I should approach him.
He, in fact, had the capacity to make contact with that donor if he decided to.
Dear Professor de Kretser, I'm writing to you because you were the doctor who facilitated the conception of myself using artificial insemination with donor sperm. I was really nervous because I knew that basically this was my last shot. So everything hung on the personal ethics of one man.
Dear Lauren, this will take a little time, so please be patient. I wrote to the donor indicating that there had been some interest arising out of the research project that he participated in many years ago, and would he be willing to contact me and have a discussion about that issue.
I didn't know what he was talking about for the first minute or two. I thought this was a bit peculiar. He got the wrong person, and then I suddenly realised what it was. I thought this person must have been somebody who'd put in a lot of effort and felt very deeply about it to break down a lot of legal and organisational barriers. So I thought I'd just go along with it at that stage.
For the first time, I didn't have to refer to him by this impersonal moniker of C11. He actually had a name. Dear Ben, I'm looking forward to writing this letter, but it's hard to start. Self-appraisal is difficult, but I try to be a fairly chilled out person who remains calm under pressure. Best wishes, Lauren.
The 11th of the 8th, 2009. Hello, Lauren. It is all strange, as you say, to be connected to someone who is a fully lived adult, only to discover it out of nowhere. My own interests include medicine. I studied at Monash and I'm a GP in Wonthaggi and Inverloch. Divorced in 2008, 3 children, Charlotte, 17, Michael, 15, Olivia, 14. When I signed the agreement and agreed to be a sperm donor, I did it in response to a request, and I did it with the understanding that it would be completely confidential forever. Used to hand over the sperm and get $10 and get out of there as quickly as possible, I think. I'm lively and withdrawn, depending on mood, just like my father. You sound like a smart one. There are a lot of smart people in my family, as you can see from the family tree.
The first thing I saw was the name, which was written at the top of the letter, and it was Benedict Manning Clark, and that was actually a name I recognised back from when I was looking at the degrees conferred from Monash.
My father was Manning Clark, 1915 to 1991, Professor of History at ANU, commentator, a lawyer of Conservatives, writer. It would be good to hear from you again. Cheers, Ben.
Manning Clark was a romantic, a wit, a passionate man who went in search of the Australian heart. Through his 6-volume History of Australia, we discovered his dream.
And I was just blown away because I knew who Manning Clark was. and I went and ran to the bookshelf and pulled the books out.
And in fact, contained within that biography was a picture of Lauren's biological father, Ben, as well. So all the time she'd been searching for this information, it was in her home.
After Lauren and I wrote a couple of times to each other, I rang her up in Melbourne and then I asked her to come down and visit me sometime.
I was really nervous on the day, incredibly nervous. There'd just been a continual, almost like a splinter in my brain just of all these questions that unanswered and nothing to fill in the gap.
Yeah, Olivia's quite sporty as well. I think she's going to be a good footballer, actually.
It was really bizarre because I was surrounded by strangers, but it was strangers that kind of looked like me.
Dad was very competitive. He used to pretend he was just playing the game but would hate losing.
Yeah.
At the same time.
I think I can relate to that.
Yeah, especially at ping pong. It's really odd. As though there's a whole period in somebody's life that you've been part of in some way but completely absent from.
My sister and I thought that it would be a good idea to take Lauren to Canberra to see my grandparents' house.
So how many times have you guys been to the house?
A lot when our grandmother was alive.
Would have liked to have met her.
By meeting each member of the family, she can see little parts of herself and learn where certain attributes, physical and emotional, came from.
I'm Lauren.
I'm Roland.
Hi.
And my sister, Katerina.
Hi. Hi, Katerina. It's really interesting to be in the house where Ben grew up. Quite a library. Because we're walking in the same footsteps as Manny and Dimphna and Ben and his brothers and sisters.
So this is Dad's study and you can see Parliament House over through there.
Well, she seems very warm and spontaneous and outgoing, so it's been very easy to talk to her. And she can talk about quite a range of subjects, and she seems to me to be quite insightful and thoughtful. So I like her very much, actually. So I'm glad she's part of the family.
Oh, it's good to know that there's some activism in the family because sometimes I feel a bit like get into it as well.
When Lauren found out who her donor father was, Narelle was so happy and excited.
Narelle had been living in London for a couple of years. Shortly after her arriving home, she had severe stomach pains and she was rushed to the hospital where they discovered that she had bowel cancer.
We immediately looked at our genetics in our own family and found that there was nobody we knew in our immediate family that had this disposition.
There are tests, if it's in the family, that young people can have from about 15. So had I known that there was a potential risk of bowel cancer, I could have caught this before stage 1 even.
She puts that aside and still her biggest fear, and mine, is that there's these other 8 siblings out there that may have this genetic trait.
All of them are 25 and older and they need to be screened, and I've got no way of warning them.
Basically, Narelle wanted to now change the law so it became fair for all donor-conceived children to find out who their true identity is.
In February 2013, Narelle's health had declined markedly. She was now linked up with palliative care services. She was in unbearable pain. And I wrote an email to the chair of the Law Reform Committee, Clem Newton-Brown, saying, this is ridiculous, we have to do something.
Narelle's records were locked up in a filing cabinet just down the road from here, and nobody could access those records. So I went and saw the then Premier Baillieu, and he authorised those records to be released to a third party, who then contacted Narelle's sperm donor father, Ray.
I got a letter stating we've got someone who wants to contact you. And boy, I was just excited. I was just, oh my God. I just wanted to meet her straight away.
I have such a vivid memory of her tearing open the gate and them both running to meet one another. You couldn't keep them apart.
Some part of my DNA has got what I've got a recessive gene, which in combination with Rel's mum's genes produced this situation where she was susceptible to bowel cancer, and she got it.
It's been a year now since Narelle died. My reflection is that it was all for no reason, that she went through so much pain and anguish when someone just had to ask a simple question.
If any doctors had phoned me and said, by the way, you know, you've got a child out there somewhere, I would have moved heaven and hell to get to it.
I'm here to make sure that I guess the final wishes of Narelle Gretcher are honoured. Myself and other donor-conceived people and some donors and parents fought this David and Goliath battle for all donor-conceived people to have the right to apply for information about their biological parents. I really became energised and passionate about lobbying the state Liberal government to enact those recommendations into law.
And effectively to know who you are. So.
And we also worked hard at talking to the state Labor opposition.
To me, it just seems a common sense change, one that we should make. You made the point about justice and equity and fairness and rights and human rights, and it's a fantastic example of that.
But it wasn't until 2014 that we really started to get traction because the election was looming.
Labor rises and the Premier-elect goes straight to work.
When the Labor government came into power, they decided to make it an even playing field for all donor-conceived people.
21 minutes past 4 o'clock. All Victorians conceived by egg or sperm donation will now be able to discover the identity of their donor, regardless of whether the donor wants to remain anonymous. It's an amendment that's been passed by Daniel Andrews.
When the legislation arrived, it was a world first. Now all donor-conceived people over 18 had the right to apply for information about the identity of their donor parent, and that was made retrospective, so it was regardless of previous assurances of anonymity that was given by doctors to donors. Infertility Treatment Act. Finally, the rights of the people created, you know, the most vulnerable party, were being respected and put at the centre of assisted reproductive technology. And we almost felt like the war was won, you know, that, that we'd done it, that, you know, we could all go away and relax and just go back to our normal lives.
I think maybe we can start out there.
Yeah. Okay.
Lauren was pretty exhausted emotionally, and she decided that time to hang up the hat in advocating.
We had this dream of a big road trip around the United States. I finally had a bit of time and space to reflect on everything that had just happened over the preceding, 11, 12 years since I found out I was donor conceived. We also took the opportunity to go and visit Katerina, Ben's sister, and it didn't feel strange for her to describe me as her niece, that kind of language I felt comfortable with.
But then, out of the blue, really, comes a bit of a surreptitious change in the laws of Victoria that effectively undo all of that work that was put by Lauren and the others.
In recent years, there's been something of an explosion of a demand for donor sperm. As a result, there's been pressure on government to try to liberalise and try to, increase the amount of sperm that's available for the people that want it now.
In 2018, I was approached to conduct a review, given my past involvement in the regulation of the industry in Victoria. And the government was particularly concerned that the practices of private IVF clinics were moving away from a patient-centred health service type arrangement.
When I found out about the Gorton report in 2019, it became very clear quite quickly that this was about making assisted reproductive technology more accessible and taking away the gains that I feel that we'd made through Narelle's law. When it looked like the government was going to act on the recommendations of the Gorton report, I decided that we needed to call in the big guns, so I gave Lauren Burns a call. There's so much trust in this report that the clinics are going to do the right thing.
I was shocked to discover that they want to make access to gametes cheaper and easier by reducing regulation and making it easier to import from overseas. Their biological parents might not even speak the same language as them. They also didn't listen to donor-conceived people who wanted to have a reduction in the number of siblings and families created from the one donor.
So the Victorian government's gone ahead and increased this number now to 10 families. And what that means is 10, 20, up to 50 offspring conceived from that sperm.
You know, what are we, 2021, that you still can't find out even the number of half-siblings you have. Another thing was the posthumous use of gametes, so where a donor has died. You know, how can that be in the best interest of the person created?
I certainly don't think that we have forgotten that the primary consideration in our laws is the welfare of the child to be born. That is enshrined in the legislation. My view would be that if we limited donor conception in Victoria, there would be a massive outcry. For me, the solution was the creation of a public IVF service to increase donations locally so that the fears of donor-conceived children is ultimately addressed because all donation is occurring in Victoria.
What we're potentially facing is just repeating the mistakes of the past so that the next generation will also be without meaningful connection to their biological family. And it's really frustrating because I feel a sense of responsibility that we know enough now to prevent this, that it shouldn't have to happen again.
I'm not surprised that Lauren's been drawn back into donor-conceived activism because she was extremely passionate about the issue when I first met her.
She weighed a ton.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
She's never really addressed it to our family directly, and I think we all prefer to keep what is a really lovely relationship strong and separate.
She's got star qualities, I think. I'm really happy that Murray's meeting Olivia and other members of the Clark family literally from birth, and that it'll just be normalised for her to grow up with that, and that there won't be the struggle, and she'll be able to know and be known by all of her family in the broadest sense of the word.
She kind of like a little bit looks like Charlotte as a baby. We've seen pictures of baby Charlotte.
Yeah.
So she was like the most attractive baby. It's also bizarre, again, meeting someone that's related to you, but in this sort of dystopian way where it's biological, but because I've built a relationship with Lauren, it's also a social relationship, but it doesn't really have a name, and it's still something it's hard to describe.
Say hi. Hello.
In some ways, Lauren is a little bit like having an older sister.
Well, Charlotte's going to have like 10 children and I'll have to be foster parent.
Lauren's advocacy and perseverance has definitely shown that she's incredibly stubborn. There's a lot of very stubborn people in the Clark family.
We'll have to give you some hand-me-downs.
And she's not going to stop until she thinks that, the world's as it should be.
Okay. Bye. Bye. I think in Murray we're seeing she's very determined, doesn't like to give up. She's good-natured but strong-willed. So probably at some point we'll regret trying to teach her to question authority when that authority is us.
Murray!
But yeah, in general we hope to teach her to be an independent thinker.
What does it say?
And if she feels like something's not right, then to speak up about it.
Here you go. There's the compass. Where are we going, Murray? Oi! That's not going to help us. Oi! Try again. Hey!
One more time.
Which way's north? Which way's... Oh! Classic.